Here's a Python script. It reads a config file and prints the app name. Works fine. Now, same script, same files, nothing is changed, but we run it from one directory up. No code changed, no files were moved or deleted. The only thing that changed is which directory we were in when we ran the command. If you've run into this before and found it confusing, you're not alone, and it's really straightforward if you know what's going on. It comes down to one concept that most developers use every day, but rarely think about explicitly: the working directory and how it affects what your paths actually point to. Let's get the basics out of the way. An absolute path starts from the root of your file system. That's a / on Linux and Mac, or a drive letter on Windows. It's the full address. No matter where you are when you read it, it points to the same file. A relative path doesn't start from the root. It starts from somewhere. And the question is, where is that somewhere? You've seen the shorthand before: single dot for the current directory, double dot for the parent. These are relative too, so they follow the same rules we're about to cover. Keep that in the back of your mind. A lot of developers, especially early on, assume relative paths start from the folder the script lives in. That's a reasonable assumption, and it's how a lot of people think about it. But that's not how it works. Every running process on your computer has something called a current working directory, often shortened to CWD. When you open a terminal, it starts in some directory, usually your home folder. When you cd somewhere, you change it. That path in your terminal prompt, that's your working directory. Here's how it works. When your code says open data/config.json, the language doesn't look for that file relative to where your script lives on disk. It resolves that path from the working directory of the process, which is wherever you or Cron or Docker or your CI system happen to be when the process started. Now, most of the time, these are the same place. You cd into the project folder, you run the script, everything works fine, so you naturally think that relative paths are relative to your script file. But that mental model is wrong, and it's the kind of wrong that you don't notice until you're debugging something, wondering why a file that clearly exists can't be found. Let's trace what actually happened in that first demo. This string, data/config.json, is a relative path, no leading slash, so the system takes the current working directory and appends this path to it. Same relative path, different working directory, different result. And this isn't specific to Python. This is how the operating system resolves paths. Every language works this way. When you're working locally and running things manually, this usually isn't a problem. You cd into the project folder, you run the script, the working directory is right. The bugs show up when the working directory isn't what you assumed, either because something else is running your code or because your code is being used in a context you didn't design for. Let's start with one that's subtle enough to trick even experienced developers: imported modules. You have a utility module that reads a file. The path utils/grammar.txt looks right. The file is right there next to the module. But this path doesn't resolve from where parser.py lives. It resolves from the working directory of whatever process imported it. If you run python app.py from the project root, it works. CWD plus that path lands in the right place. But if someone imports this module from a different project or runs the app from a different directory, that path breaks silently. The fix is to anchor to the module's own location. Dunder file gives you the path to this file. .resolve makes it absolute, and from there you build the path to grammar.txt. Now it works regardless of who imports it or where the main script was started. Cron jobs. Cron doesn't start in your project directory. It typically uses the user's home directory, so every relative path in your script suddenly resolves from there. This is a really common source of "it works in my terminal but fails in cron." Docker containers. The workdir directive in your Docker file sets the working directory inside the container. If it doesn't match what your code expects, relative paths will be off. And if you're mounting volumes, the paths inside the container might be completely different from your host machine. CI/CD pipelines. GitHub Actions, GitLab CI, Jenkins, they all clone your repo into some directory, but if a build step CDs into a subdirectory, the next step might have a different working directory than you expected. Relative paths that assumed the repo root will quietly break. Your IDE. Your code works when you click Run in VS Code, you open a terminal, run the exact same file, and it breaks. Same machine, same code, same files. What changed? The working directory. VS Code sets it to the workspace root when you hit Run, not the directory the file is in. If your code works in one context but fails in another, and nothing else changed, the working directory is almost certainly the answer. So you've hit one of these. Here's a practical tip that's worth more than it sounds. Just print the working directory. Usually the issue becomes obvious the second you see the output. The CWD is somewhere you didn't expect, and the relative path is resolving against that instead of where you assumed. It's a simple thing, but when you're stuck on a path issue in CI or a container, this is almost always the fastest diagnosis. Now you've seen the problem. You've seen where it shows up, and you know how to diagnose it. How do you write paths that just work regardless of where the script gets called from? The most reliable approach: build absolute paths from the script's own location. Every language gives you a way to ask, where is the source file on disk? You use that as your starting point instead of depending on the working directory. In Python, you use pathlib. Dunder file gives you the path of this script. We call .resolve to turn it into a full absolute path. This also follows symplinks, so if your script is symplinked from somewhere else, you get the real location, not the link. And then you build your path from there. Now it doesn't matter where you run this from, the project folder, your home directory, a cron job, the path always points to the right file because it's anchored to the script, not to the working directory. Same pattern in every language. In Node, dunder dirname gives you the script's folder. In ES modules, you derive it, but same idea. In Bash, $0 gives you the script path. The principle is always the same: anchor to the file, not to the CWD. Two other approaches also come up in practice. One is to change the working directory at the start of your script so it matches the script's location. This works. All your relative paths will resolve the way you'd expect, but you're mutating global state for the entire process. If any other part of your code or a subprocess you spawn uses relative paths expecting the original working directory, those will silently resolve to the wrong place. Fine for simple one-file scripts, but for anything larger, building absolute paths is the safer choice. The other, and this is more relevant if you're deploying to containers or multiple environments, is environment variables. You set the path per environment, one value on your dev machine, another in your Docker config, another in your CI pipeline. The code doesn't need to know the details, and you never hardcode a path that's only valid in one place. Quick rule of thumb: use dunderfile or dunder dirname when your data files ship alongside your code. Use environment variables when the paths change between environments, and os.chd only if you know what you're doing and you're keeping it simple. Here's the picture to take with you. Your script is a file on disk. When it runs, it becomes a process. That process gets a working directory, not from the script, but from whatever started it: your terminal, cron, Docker, a CI runner, an IDE. Every relative path in your code resolves against that directory. And if you anchor your paths to the script's own location, the working directory becomes irrelevant. That's the fix. That error from the beginning? Now you know what happened and how to prevent it. The whole concept fits in one sentence: relative paths resolve from the working directory, not from your script file. But understanding that sentence will make path errors obvious instead of confusing. If this was helpful, a like helps other developers find it. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.